We're going to move from local and state jurisdictions to the federal level in our discussion today. I'm personally very excited to be able to conduct this conversation. I've been looking forward to it since Amy invited me to have this discussion with you, Kate.
Thanks so much. It's so great to be here.
Yeah, and I think particularly given what we've been talking about, and we talked about supranational with Governor Inslee, we talked about with the lieutenant governors, we talked about activity, at the state level and so much that can be done there. You have worked in those jurisdictions yourself, and you're now at the federal level. Maybe you can share a bit about your background and what brought you to DOE with our audience, and then we can dig into some of your current activities.
Thanks so much. It's so great to be here, see a lot of friends out there. So wonderful to see everybody and be back in the state. I didn't actually move to DC. My family put their foot down collectively, and so they are still, and I am often still in Berkeley, but I spent a lot of time in the air. But it is always so great to be back here. And, it's a really exciting moment. I mean, my first job in the energy and climate world 20 years ago was this little organization called the Apollo Alliance. Some of you might remember. And our whole thing was bringing together business, labor, community, and environmental stakeholders around, actually advancing a clean energy economy. That led to a lot of what ended up in the Recovery Act. It led to the creation of the Blue-Green Alliance, which it ultimately merged with, and the creation of Green for All. But bringing all those pieces together, kind of at the local level to accomplish bigger goals has sort of always been my passion in this space. And it's just such an exciting moment with this administration in Washington, this is what we're doing. We have a president and a Secretary of Energy who are deeply committed to an whole of government approach that really brings all of those pieces together underneath this climate strategy to meet our climate goals. And the president really believes that we cannot meet those goals unless we have a strategy that works for people and for places, that works at the local level, that isn't one size fits all, that really is driven by partnerships with people. And so that's, for me, super exciting because it's sort of always been my approach. I'm an organizer by training, so it's sort of always been my approach, and now I get to do it at the federal level. So who wouldn't want to do that?
Absolutely. I can understand why you jumped at that opportunity, and it is really thrilling to see climate action, back in the executive branch. I think we're all really thrilled as climate leaders to see that happen and to see significant pieces of legislation come through in recent months. Can you share some top priorities at DOE and what it's been like to be a part of that action?
Yeah, there's so much going on. So the challenge I always have is how do you break it down? And I do want to say, before jumping in on the federal side, that, I was incredibly honored and fortunate to be able to serve Governor Newsom in his first term as his climate advisor and as the head of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And in that role, piloted some of the things that we're now doing, honestly, at the federal level. The whole of government approach that we took, first ever climate cabinet, first ever climate budget in those first few years. COVID, of course, was a big rock in that pond, very, very challenging, but also underscored, I think, to all of us how frankly vulnerable our current system was to supply chain shocks, to climate shocks, to economic shocks. And so all of that for me was really, really important coming into this role, and I think others as well, because the way that the federal legislation, and it really is a package of federal legislation. I know we all love to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. It is the single biggest climate policy in history of this country. However, it can't really be looked at unless it's in combination with the American Rescue Plan, which was the recovery out of COVID, helping communities build out economic development muscle, figure out how to do transition plans that were more resilient. That's all American Rescue Plan. Into the infrastructure bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which really is the foundational investments in transmission, in roads, in broadband, in charging infrastructure, all the things we need to make all of this happen, along with big demonstration and deployment projects like the hydrogen hubs the Lieutenant Governor talked about. into the CHIPS and Science Act, which my boss, Secretary Granholm, likes to call the brains, right? If the infrastructure bill is the backbone, the CHIPS and Science Act is the brains. That's really our rebuilding our leadership on semiconductors. We are very, very vulnerable to supply chain shocks on semiconductors. They're in every single one of the technologies that we've all been talking about at this conference. And then building into the Inflation Reduction Act, the heart and lungs of the whole thing, which really says, okay, how do we actually scale this up? How do we get the private sector on board? How do we do this at the scale it needs to be? So that package is a critical package. We've never seen anything really like it since the New Deal in terms of an investment in a transformation of the economy from one that's powered by a set of extractive industries with refining and transportation with a global commodity market to a set of distributed energy industries that are diversified, distributed, more resilient, and more able to really help communities and workers and businesses grow all over this country. So I'm super excited about all of it. I mean, it's hard to even know how to break it down. Department of Energy is in a great position in this. And I should say, I went to the department for a couple of reasons. One is I was, Secretary Granholm, when she was a governor, was a partner of ours at the Apollo Alliance. I've worked with her for years. That was on her board at the American Jobs Project. She has long been a believer in this. She literally combined her energy and labor departments in Michigan to have a whole of government approach on energy, right? So she has been walking this walk for a long time. She's also just amazing and a rock star for anyone who hasn't met her. But it's also exciting to be a DOE because we are like the engine of all of this. The department got $62 billion in new funds through the infrastructure bill. That was 60 new programs and scaling up of an additional 12 that we already had, like the Weatherization Assistance Program got a lot of new money. But huge shift for us from our 1977 roots of being a basic science and research organization, basically. We have the 17 national labs. We do an enormous amount of innovation. But now we're also doing steel in the ground. We're building things. We are a deployment agency. We literally restructured the entire agency around that. We built out a whole new Undersecretary Office of Infrastructure. We have all kinds of new people coming in through our Clean Energy Corps. We're hiring 1,000 people. It's incredibly exciting. And now with the Inflation Reduction Act, mostly run by the Treasury, actually, because it's mostly tax credits. But we're in a position of being able to be do technical assistance, and we're running a big chunk of that around clean energy manufacturing. So it's super exciting time. Like, we are basically the deployment. We're like the engine of deployment of this whole thing, and it's just such a great time.
I'd like to delve into one aspect of these programs that you and I've talked a little bit about, and I think plays off well of particularly the environmental justice and aspects that were mentioned earlier today, which is the place-based approach, which is a phrase you used just a few moments ago. Can you tell us what that place-based approach really is and how it informs these new programs?
Yeah, absolutely, and it is my central to my work. I mean, the secretary brought me in as a senior advisor on place-based investment, so my whole thing is place-based. And really what it means is sort of what I started with, which is how do we make the best investments, not just because they're the best technology widget, which is sort of where our heads have been for years, frankly, in this space, is sort of how do we get the best technology cheapest has been the fundamental kind of question on the clean energy economy. We're now asking, how do we get the best technology into places in a way that we can do it? We do in partnership with those places and with those workers and with those communities. That is a different approach. It's place-based work is not new. It's the economic development world has been thinking about it for a long time, but it's being driven in this administration in a really new way. And you can see that actually. The executive order on climate, the big executive order on climate, the first week of the administration the president signed, created, of course, two really important components of the place-based approach. One of them was Justice 40. The commitment by this administration that 40% of the benefits of our clean energy and climate policies will go to disadvantaged and underserved communities. The Department of Energy has over 150 programs that fall into that category. We're the largest by far of all the agencies committed to Justice 40. But the second was creating the interagency work group on coal and power plant communities. And that's a recognition that as we look at this transition, as we look at this new economic development model that's more sustainable and more resilient and more equitable, it will have profound effects both on those communities that led in the traditional energy economy or have been leading and are now looking toward the future and for trying to figure out how to do that. And also profound effects on those who were left out of the traditional energy economy and or unequally burdened by it. So it's really a place-based approach to the whole thing, is to say, there are priority communities in this transition. How do we think about those communities? How do we have a truly just transition that focuses, again, on individual communities and individual places? And just as an example of that, two examples. One, a pilot program that we started in under Secretary Granholm called Communities Leap. There's a number of California communities that are part of this, where we're actually, and this is unusual for us, we're actually doing multi-technology kind of approaches in places. We put out a call for proposals from communities to say, we will offer you the benefit of our lab, our national lab, and our Department of Energy expertise to help you figure out a transition strategy in your community. Got applications from all over the country, and we prioritized applications from communities that were unequally burdened by pollution and communities that were in transition from fossil fuels. And so that's a really cool program because that looks very different in each of those communities. We've got two. We've got one in Bakersfield, one in Kern County. We have one in Stockton. We have one in Richmond. We have a number of others around the country. So that is really us working to help, not just coming in when somebody's like, oh, I want to build a small modular reactor. We're like, okay, we'll draw up the plans. You know, that's the sort of old DOE. Now we're really working with these communities on sort of what are their assets? How do we do the asset mapping? How do we think about what the opportunities are? And the other way we're doing this that many of you may have come across is a lot of our programming at DOE is actually through competitive grants where we can't direct the funding to particular places. So we started thinking sort of how do we make sure that's working in a place-based way? And for the first time ever, myself, Shalonda Baker, who's a real leader in our agency on economic impact and diversity, and Bethany Jones, who leads on our energy workforce work, the three of us put together an internal work group and created a community benefits plan structure that now requires that companies applying for funding from us, including the hydrogen hubs, including battery manufacturing, they need to tell us their plan for providing benefits to communities and workers. That plan is 20% of the application. So for the first time, we are not only asking for it, we are scoring it, and it's written into the contracts when we provide the awards.
Which is a phenomenal way to actually achieve that goal.
It's huge, and
as
you know,
and I've discussed.
And it underscores, you know, procurement is policy. Mm-hmm. I mean, honestly, what keeps me up at night, what I wake up and every day thinking about and go to bed thinking about is how is what I'm doing going to last beyond me? Political appointees are short timers by definition. How are we embedding this stuff into systems run by career feds, into procurement systems, into contract systems, into our review process? Right? It's all those tactical things that sometimes you don't think about when you're up here with the politics. But honestly, like, what we do not want is for all of this to fall apart when this administration, you know, it moves on.
And that's a great point. One of the things you and I talked a little bit about before this session, there's been a lot of discussion in the news, and those of us who come from the energy industry understand the difficulty around permitting, for example. Yeah. And how can these changes and shifts in this place-based approach help de-risk projects for permitting, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really a hot topic right now. And to take a little issue with Ezra Klein, everybody in Washington is talking about Ezra Klein's Everything Bagel article. Did people read the Everything Bagel article? Where he basically says, you know, you're loading up all these programs with all this stuff. Like, you're loading it up with equity, you're loading it up with workforce. Like, what we need is just like, you know, to get it all deployed. Right, we need a plain bagel. We do need to get it all deployed, but we really feel actually that that project viability depends on intentional work with communities, on providing high quality jobs, on providing access to those jobs.
Absolutely.
We really think you're reducing your litigation risk, you're reducing project risk if you're in there from the beginning with a strategy, which is what we're asking for. To, like, what does your community actually look like? Have you thought about it? You know, how are you thinking about leveraging the existing workforce? How are you going to make sure you're reaching out to these key populations? And how are you making sure your job quality is high enough that your project will be built well and won't fall apart? So we're really focused on that as a risk reduction strategy. Like, we don't have federal permitting bill right now, but we do have strategies that we can employ that will make this easier. And frankly, a lot of that comes from time, again, in California. I mean, I had the honor and very big challenge of running the part of the governor's office that focuses on, to the earlier question, land use policy, infill housing, VMT reduction, very, very tricky in this state. And that work really depends on exactly what I'm talking about. It depends on not talking about it up here with a bunch of platitudes, but getting into these communities and saying, this is what this looks like here. This is what this looks like in your neighborhood. Let's talk about what you want to see. Here's our goal. Let's talk about how you want to get to it. That's the only way to get these projects done.
I would absolutely agree with you. Could we maybe talk a little bit about your views on the role for the private sector and philanthropic communities? I mean, we have such a great mix in this audience.
Yeah, I mean, we always say, and I think it was probably Jigger Shaw who first said this, who's the head of our loan program office. I'm sure you all know Jigger. He's larger than life. He first said, and now everybody is saying, this whole transition will be private sector led and government enabled. Mm-hmm. Everything I'm talking about, all of our grants going out, our 50-50 cost share with the private sector, all of the money in Inflation Reduction Act is basically in tax credits for the private sector or direct pay in some cases. So the private sector is going to get us to speed and scale. The government needs to be there enabling on the hard stuff. We need to be there doing the demonstration, pre-commercial demonstrations of the hard stuff that we haven't quite figured out the model yet in the market. That's the hydrogen. It's direct air capture. It's small modular reactors. We are in there doing that stuff with 50% cost share, so we're putting money on the line. But we also need the private sector. We need private sector to come in and tell us how to do that right. But also we need private sector to come in and really scale up where things are commercial, but they're just not at scale. We've got to build 47,000 miles of transmission if we're going to actually meet our climate goals in this country. 47,000 miles. That is huge. We're going to have to dramatically increase our battery production domestically. We're going to have to dramatically increase our semiconductor production. We're going to have to build out the supply chains to be less vulnerable in the case of future economic shocks and future climate shocks. So that's going to take the private sector. So I would just say private sector, this is a moment. We are in a moment. These things are not going to be on the table forever. Most of them are time limited. This is the moment to take advantage, to talk about this, to tell everyone about the opportunity, to take advantage of the opportunity. It's a moment for unusual players like tribes to come in and use the direct pay options under the Inflation Reduction Act to actually build and own the projects on their land instead of just being subject to the projects on their land. This is an amazing moment. On the philanthropy side, we need capacity and technical assistance and support in the communities that we are asking to be at the table with these companies. We're asking communities to be at the table. We're asking workers to be at the table. They don't always have the support and the capacity to be at that table in a really strong way. We're asking philanthropy, get in there, support people with convening power, with helping with planning, transition planning. The communities that are coming to us with plans are far more competitive than those that aren't. So help out these communities with the asset mapping, the look across at what their opportunities are. Help these communities, frankly, negotiate community benefits agreements and community workforce agreements. Those things take lawyers. They take consultants. They take folks, and the companies tend to have those things, and the communities tend not to. So there's a real role for philanthropy here in building this out. And I guess the last thing I'll say about the philanthropy side, philanthropy in this country can sometimes be a little short term in thinking, and this is really a moment. We are talking about an economic development and economic transformation of this country, of this world. This is a moment to think about long-term investments in communities. Help build that capacity and let it stay there. Not just for a year till they have to apply again for another grant, but for 5 years, for 10 years, really building out those people who are trusted at the local level to be honestly the emissaries and the ambassadors of this work at the local level. We really need that. So I would just highly encourage that.
Thank you so much. I think we have just a couple minutes if we want to take some questions. And then...
There's one behind you.
Yes.
I have to say, I love everything bagels. And
I do
let's,
too.
So do I.
who doesn't love
Yay,
everything
Kelly.
bagels?
I mean, who doesn't really?
And you said Secretary Granholm was a rock star. I'm working on a community benefits section of a grant right now, and you are a rock star. This is such a good idea.
Thank
I'm
you.
so happy to be doing this because it's necessary. My question, after fangirling you for a little while there, my question is, I am a grant writer, so a lot of my clients that I'm trying to bring up their companies in this space, they're asking me, is there a pipeline for sort of the grant trajectory we're on? Will there be a grant next year to follow this one in the pipeline we're in? I've worked with hydrogen companies, I've worked with wind and solar and all these. Is that sort of built into the structure? And I love what you said about embedding it in the system so it'll survive past this administration, which I'm hoping is for the next 4 years, and then the next finish out this 4 years, next 4 years after that, and then people will get that, hey, this works.
Yeah.
And, but continuity of the grant pathways is my question.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and thank you, first of all. And thank you for being out there helping people with the community benefits plans, because we know this is new for some companies and for some communities. So we're excited to do everything we can to support you and others that are helping with it. We're trying to do a couple things. We're splitting up a bunch of our programs into sequential grant so that we can actually, exactly for what you're saying, like our battery manufacturing grants, for instance, we got $8 billion in the infrastructure bill for those, but we only put out $2.5 billion for the first tranche because we wanted to learn from that first tranche. That was the first tranche of awards which had what we then called equity plans, which are now called community benefits plans in them, and we've learned a lot from that process. I will say, however, I'm very proud to say we gave 21 awards in our first battery grant tranche, and 13 of them committed to enforceable negotiated community benefits plans. So that is like very exciting for us, which include project labor agreements and/or community workforce agreements or community benefits agreements. So we are trying to break up the grants into tranches so that we can give people more opportunity. Our big $1 billion program for rural and remote areas, we're breaking up into actually several types of grants for the same reason. We're doing a set of prizes, we're doing a set of small grants that are rolling applications, and then we're going to do the big ones. So that's a really different model for us, and I think it's based on feedback from stakeholders that we're doing that. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity to learn. We also on the community benefits strategy, to your point about continuity, I mean, we designed them originally for the infrastructure bill because it's sort of, in some ways it's the easiest place to do it. It's like big pots of money going out in big amounts with competitive processes that have a scoring system. So it was like, we could say, okay, 20% goes to this, there's this process. We've actually, and we created a template for that internally, both for the big deployment projects, and we also have an R&D template. So for research and development projects, we actually have a community benefits plan strategy as well that looks at things like the diversity of the research team and things like that. It's pretty interesting. Those templates now, I'm getting calls. I got one this morning from one of our project teams over in our contract office, over in our Golden office, which does all our contracting. They called and they were like, oh, I'm working on this funding opportunity announcement that's not for one of the infrastructure bill grants, it's for annual appropriations and vehicle technologies. We're using the R&D template for CBP, for the community benefits plans. Is that the right one to use? So it wasn't even a, should we even think about community benefits plans? It wasn't a, oh, I see this is only infrastructure bill, we don't have to pay attention to it. It was like, we're doing this thing over here, which template do we use? So that to me is a really great sign that this might outlast us, which is, again, I think should be everybody's goal.
Excellent. Okay, I think we should move on to the next panel. Thank you so much, Kate. What a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
What a
So
pleasure
great
to
to
have
see
you here.
everybody.
Such a delight.
Thank you.
Such a delight.